which is one of the big changes that was made in this.
Does it go beyond consulting and consent?
It does go. It goes to consent in 3 circumstances. Basically, when there are fundamental adverse impacts, such as taking land, moving people, or accessing cultural heritage.
Josh, I could pick up on the integration of the social and cultural aspects in terms of implementation, and the whole NPI management plan and strategy needs to incorporate all those findings through the, as they come through in the biodiversity action planning. It's actually biodiversity ecosystem services action plan, and that gets worked into the implementation processes and programs. And these are fairly complex very often, and of course have to take into consideration for their sustainable implementation the communities, the social and cultural requirements. So that has to be a fundamental part of the implementation plan.
Thanks for that. Could I ask Stuart to talk a little bit about the process and criteria for selecting the panel, the members of this esteemed audit group? And
well, actually, you're probably better speaking to Tom.
Okay, maybe. Fine, Tom, you want to just tell us about that?
So, for the review panel to give an operation. Yeah. So, I guess I'll turn the question around to you and seek your advice on that. It hasn't been done yet, and I think it's an open question how we develop the mechanisms to do that. As I say, balancing these sort of 2 key principles that are necessary for it to deliver the benefits that we want of both credibility and the scientific rigor, along with local and national legitimacy.
Well, there's a commission that deals with these issues that you might want to consult for some on.
There is a commission that deals with the social and cultural impacts as well as the scientific, the natural impacts, the CEASP, and you could consult the leadership of CEASP or the theme in CEASP to find somebody to work on that panel, and the other panels.
So while we're on the topic of participation, social and cultural issues, Stuart, do you want to say anything about how this work relates to other work going on at IUCN on local governance?
Yeah, I'll just make a comment. But notwithstanding Pippa's comment, that actually looking at social impacts, cultural impacts is actually part of the broader assessment. I do think still, that MPI will actually need to build in. We've raised this issue. Actually, this issue came up very strongly 2 nights ago. We still now need to really look at the impacts, the social impacts from the whole MPI process and how one works through the mitigation hierarchy. And that's partly some of our work recently in IUCN has shown, and it's been reinforced by work by C4 as well, that constantly the level of natural resource dependency is underestimated. It's been underestimated by governments, donors, conservation organisations have been really good at underestimating the level of natural resource dependency. Our figures are showing regularly for rural coastal communities, you're talking about 25-30% of material household benefit comes off farm from wild resources. And that's obviously got implications. It's not just for where the hole in the ground is made, it's also for where the offset will be. You can't be, and because, remember, the offset will be an area that is under threat. Therefore, it implies there must be some human activity. And we all know from our conservation community, from our conservation practice in the past, bad decisions or inappropriate decisions of protecting an area where people are actually working in without taking into consideration their use and their involvement. So I think these are really serious issues that we need to build in more regularly. And then just to add again to that, it's not just material benefit, because for many of these communities, it is also the engagement in a practice that identifies them culturally. Many of the First Nations, for example, in North America, to fish or to hunt makes it that's an identifying attribute. So I think those are the issues we'll actually need to build in really to make sure that MPI really is credible. And I'm glad to say, just final word, I'm glad to say it's not just me and a few people like Richard who've been saying that. There's actually been several of Peter's team have actually been saying this as well. So I've been finding common cause actually in some of the Rio Tinto meetings with colleagues from Rio Tinto on this.
Okay, great. Thanks for that. I want to turn it back this direction, maybe on a different topic, a different issue. Somebody want to go for it and introduce yourself, please.
Hi there, Warren Funston from Estimates and Electrical Utility in South Africa. I have two questions quickly. I'm directed at the Rio Tinto personnel and at Thomas. Does the NPI mean now that no-go options are defunct? To what extent is the NPI dependent on Rio Tinto's physical presence? After mine closure, can we ensure that NPI values will still be upheld, and does the review cater for that?
Thank you. Tom, was that for you?
Start and I'll follow.
Or
So on the second question, I think I mentioned there are still issues of permanence to be addressed. I think that they include ecological questions, but also include economic questions, and there's some work going on to look at developing sustainable finance, trust fund type mechanisms post for maintaining the biodiversity of a given site post closure. But I think we're quite a long way from having any sort of standard formula for those. But I certainly agree that if there's a net negative impact either on site or elsewhere, and this is going to be credibly claimed as net positive impact, then it does need to be in a permanent sense. The first question.
the other question is whether does NPI mean that no-go is defunct?
I can actually comment.
You want to start on that?
Go for it, Stuart.
The application of the NPI piece at the moment is post-project approvals, and I think we need to make an important differentiation there, because this started to creep into the discussion the other night around offsets. We receive our licence to operate through a government process. That's where the no-go-go decisions are made. So while we're looking and working with our stakeholders on looking at thresholds around offsetability, at this point in time, the decision about no-go or go to the project has already been made. So we're not coupling those two together. The other piece, and certainly this is just a personal reflection, because we're asked this all the time, is that until we can reach a status quo in terms of level playing fields, leadership positions in this are very vexed in terms of go, no go, and voluntarily passing up opportunities and projects that have been legitimately approved by governments, when there is the potential risk that another company will just step straight back in. It doesn't change the playing field at all. So the issue of no-go-go is very relevant in these discussions, but it sits at a higher level than the NPI piece and the NPI counting.
If I could just comment on that, this comes up again and again, the idea that if you allow offsets or compensation, then the regulator will be more relaxed about damage. I think that would be a great research project for somebody to go out and look at established schemes. Has that actually happened? Do regulators actually relax their stance and make it easier for companies that make significant commitments to compensation? I don't know what the case would be. Peter's shaking his head, so he has an opinion. Stuart, did you want to comment on this?
Yeah, but Peter, go ahead.
No, you go.
I think this is actually for the IUCN constituency. This is actually a very important point that we need to consider. I certainly don't feel that. I've heard several times NPI is a way of actually getting the regulators to back off. I certainly don't feel that is the case, and it's certainly not the case in many of the areas where we work. For example, in West Africa. In fact, what I would consider, based on what Stuart said, is what we should be looking at, and certainly us as a conservation community, is how we actually start to encourage, particularly our state members, put in place the regulations that create that sort of level playing field. And I think one thing, it's great the IFC are there. It's great with the advances we've seen in Performance Standard 6, but I think there's also a key role for the World Bank as well. We need to see the IFC and the World Bank working together to actually, so that we start to get regulatory frameworks that really allow NPI to work, make the level playing field, and hopefully actually advance some of the shortfalls we have in actually regulation of impact on these in these areas.
I totally agree with that. In fact, our sad experience is that quite often in discussions with the government, it isn't an issue of them seeing sort of an NPI situation as, okay, well, this is a way of being a sort of tacit compliance with regulations, but quite to the contrary. The government is very concerned if there's going to be any diminution in the economic asset in terms of, you know, set-asides or something that will actually reduce its economic value. And so I think a real crucial challenge is how do you bring this type of process to bear to the attention of government so that they recognize that this is in the long-term interest of the country. And for that, there's got to be some sort of recognition of the broader value that conservation brings. And I think that cannot be delinked from the whole social aspects. That's what really will get their attention, and the issue of social license to operate. Governments are very wary anywhere about social disruption. And so, you know, now that it's so clear that particularly with indigenous groups and local communities often have significant ties to those natural resources, there is a link there. But it's, this is one of the big challenges, I think, about how we raise this as a methodology and approach that is more clearly understood by governments.
So selling this to governments is one challenge. They want to maximize jobs, exports, tax revenue. Selling it to investors is another. Peter, maybe you want to comment on that, and also you had some comment on the previous.
Well, I just really wanted to come back and emphasize that, you know, none of these programs within a company sit isolated. So they do have to connect and integrate. And the question about sort of closure, I mean, closure planning for us actually starts right at the start of an asset. Closure planning is part of our process of actually committing to a project, understanding how that's going to happen, and managing that over the life of the asset. And clearly, closure planning connects very closely to how we manage in biodiversity. The same with all the social aspects. So within all our social programs, we've got the programs around cultural heritage. It's a critical component of what we do as well. So the connections are very important. In terms of selling to the investment community, I mean, I think, you know, one of the sort of things that certainly has caught their attention is the work that Bill has been doing. I mean, there's been big recognition through the IFC performance standard of the importance of biodiversity, and that being put within the IFC's performance standard is certainly echoed with other sort of international finance organisations and all the network associated with that. I find as I talk to investors generally, their understanding this is an issue, they recognise it's an issue, their level of understanding is still low. So certainly it's something given the sort of leadership position we've taken, we try and sort of talk to them. But there's certainly a lot of education that needs to go on in the investment community to get them to a level of understanding of really the sort of importance of risk. But I'd have to say that in terms of the investment community, this isn't the sort of sole issue. I'd say there's an awful lot of education across the range of social and environmental issues to do to get them to a better position. But certainly it's something we want to try and achieve, because it's, again, I think beneficial for them to understand the process that we're using to manage risks to value for shareholders.
Thanks for that. Joe, I saw your hand up. If you have a comment or a question, maybe while you're at it, tell us what Shell's thinking on this whole approach.
Well, briefly, Joe Cochran from Shell. And I think as Allard said yesterday, many of you might have heard him speak, this is something that Shell is looking at quite seriously at the moment. And in that looking, I've been trying to make a business case for this to our senior leaders and so on. And I actually think there's a virtuous circle in some of what's been discussed in the last few minutes, because one of the things I advocate internally is the behaviour that having an NPI commitment, I think, will drive inside the company, because far from a licence to trash, offsets are difficult, they can be very expensive, they're institutionally and politically and socially very tricky to implement. So actually, we don't really want to have to do them unless we absolutely have to. So when looking at sensitive areas, the behaviour that I think having this commitment will drive is that we will look much harder at avoiding through better site selection. We'll look much harder at innovation to reduce our footprints. And we'll start looking at innovative mitigation measures because we only want to do an offset if there's really no alternative. So I think, you know, that is a positively reinforcing behaviour, and it's attractive to our leaders because they like things that drive better outcomes. They like things that innovate and drive new technologies and so on. And that also, I think, is probably ultimately interesting for investors, although I haven't gone as far as testing that either. But that was really just the add I wanted to make to that.
Thanks very much. I think that's a really important point, that offsets increase the cost of a development project and increase therefore the incentives to avoid and minimize. That's the whole idea. In the back there was a comment. Introduce yourself, please.
Yes, I'm Julio Garte from the Peruvian Foundation for Conservation of Nature, of Naturaleza, and we work in Peru and the highlands of the lowland Amazon. And I asked representative to Rio Tinto if they have the intention to apply this program to Peru or another part of South America.
That's a question for Peter, I guess.
Stuart, do you want to take that?
The short answer is yes. You know, through the screening processes, and I'm assuming you're speaking of the La Grata project. That's on the radar as one of the operations where we'll be looking at doing the work around biodiversity action planning and mitigation hierarchy in the MPI piece. So yes.
Thank you. Next.
Hi, sorry, Warren Moss from De Beers, South Africa. Josh didn't get an answer to his first question about how do we get companies, you know, to all take on to this. De Beers have got an aspiration. I mean, I call it an aspiration, but our objective is to achieve no net loss, and we're also grappling with how to do that. So one of my questions initially was exactly that: how do you get companies? If it's a voluntary sort of method and aspiration, you've actually got to talk the same language, which is important. So, you know, Rio Tinto talks about net positive impact, we talk about no net loss. Now, the difference I think is that Stuart, I don't know how you look at this. If you want to achieve net positive impact, that's assuming obviously you've got your significance of biodiversity, or the impact of the significance is there. From a De Beers perspective, if you're trying to achieve no net loss, what you're saying is that there are going to be instances where the impact on biodiversity might not be significant, but the aspiration of the company is to achieve a no net loss of biodiversity. So in those instances you mentioned, you're only dealing with those at the moment of significance. What about the other mining operations where there isn't a significant biodiversity impact, but your aspiration is positive? What do you do in those instances?
The screening process at the moment that we've put in place is really just to make sure that we're focusing on where the key issues are. So it's looking at critical risks for the group. There is a whole suite of operations that sit below that in what we would classify as sort of moderate biodiversity context, or even low. You know, we have operations and plants in the middle of Rotterdam Harbour, for instance. You know, that's certainly a low. That doesn't exclude them from this process, and we have a number of operations that feel, because of a local need, you know, with their constituents within that region, implementing the biodiversity program themselves. And Kennecott Copper in Utah, in the United States, is one of those. You know, it's a moderate context site, but they feel that to implement the process there is very valid and has a very strong business case for them. So, you know, while we're doing this screening place at the moment, that's really just to make sure that we're focusing on the key areas, because like all of the organisations, whether we're NGOs or private sector, we have limited capacity and limited resources, so you've got to focus on those key points first. You know, all are potentially within that suite, and certainly your biggest upside, your biggest opportunity side are potentially with those moderates or the lows, if you can identify the regional gains. So if you're dealing with a highly degraded landscape where you've got a mining site operated, there's some key biodiversity areas next door within the region, that's a win-win. You know, we've got a low residual impact and a very high potential in terms of biodiversity gain. So we're not saying that the others are not going to come into the process, but we're just really focusing on where we've got the key issues first.
Thanks. I picked up two questions there, one around jargon, and I'm going to come back to John Ekstrom to give us a quick guidance on terminology, no net loss, net positive impact, biodiversity offsets, mitigation if you're in the US. Help us out with that. But first, back to the panel, just on this question that Warwick asked about, how do we get more buy-in to this from companies as well as from governments? Anybody want to have a go?
So I think this sticks and carrots that are out there in terms of companies. First of all, NGOs and others, communities are becoming much more sophisticated in their ability to track impacts broadly on habitat. So companies have got to recognize that they're taking fairly significant risks. Those that have public exposure. I think this is one of the issues, is a big differentiation between large public companies who have their stock price at risk and their reputation at risk versus companies that are accessing funds in other ways, maybe not listed. They don't have that same sort of market pressure, but nevertheless that pressure is there. And we've talked about the social license to operate. It simply makes good business sense for companies to handle this well, and we've seen how it's been